Hi, and welcome to Surprised by Joy. I'm Rustin Comer, and this is Danielle Jones, and we're part of the pastoral team here at Wayzata Community Church. We're so glad that you're joining us on this 30-day adventure into the book of Philippians as we study Paul's words in this letter to a church that he loved dearly in Philippi. You may be wondering why we're sitting so close. As I said last week, Danielle and I and John have all been working with the videoing and everything that happens to keep the worship life of the church alive. And so we've been quarantining together in many ways in terms of how we engage. But we're being very safe, and we're, have tons of hand sanitizer and all the things that we need to be safe outside of this. So thank you so much for your concern, and we'll continue to be very careful, as we hope you are as well during this time of quarantine. So yesterday, or the video that you watched yesterday, we ended the chapter 1 of Philippians talking about suffering. And so before we jump into chapter 2, I just want to recap part of yesterday's words as we spoke about Paul and suffering. Suffering is something altogether different than belief to Paul. It's not that it's just the next logical step. For Paul, belief leads to the kind of living that is so outside of step with everyone and everything else around you that pretty soon you're going to end up as a threat to those around you, right? Like, they're in a Roman colony, and Paul's expecting that their way of life through belief will actually lead them to suffering no matter what they do, if they're living faithfully.
Because they're probably going to be in conflict with what the world
is saying, totally. Yeah. And so when you're a threat, other people dependent on maintaining the status quo are going to start making things difficult for you. And Paul has seen that in his own life, and he's expecting that in the life of the church in Philippi as well. Or, right, what the second step is that they'll begin to drive you or your religion underground, which is why Paul is now in prison. Because people didn't like the things that Paul was saying. They felt like it was anti-regime or anti-empire, and they were holding him to account for it.
Yeah.
So all that Paul is speaking about when he experienced about suffering are things that Paul has already experienced in his own faith journey. So I think what Paul is saying here is that God granted the children of God in Philippi the privilege that having a faith that was so deep and broad that it's going to be threatened by the status quo of the ruling elite of that time, of Philippi. And that kind of faith for Paul is a privilege.
Right.
Right? Like, to have that kind of faith is all good, right? For Paul, he says, either I live and I keep spreading the good news of Jesus,
right,
or I die and I'm with Jesus.
Yeah, I think for Paul, in ways, suffering is affirmation that he's on the right track in following God, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's I wouldn't say this is true for Christians today in most Western realities, right? Like, we're not hyper persecuted. I know people feel like they are, but I don't believe that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't have any struggle worshiping however I want at any given moment.
Right.
I don't have, I can pray anywhere I want. I can say virtually whatever I want. And in many ways, my country protects those rights.
Yeah.
So what Paul's experiencing here with the Roman Empire is not at all comparable to what we're experiencing in the U.S. Empire.
Yeah,
right?
I
If you
agree
want to call the U.S. Empire.
wholeheartedly.
So this section of the first chapter of this beautiful letter from Paul has given me pause to wonder about what kind of faith I have, right? Like, if what Paul's really encouraging them is that their faith challenges the status quo, how is my faith challenging the status quo of my world, right? Like, how am I living into justice in a way that makes some people uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Right? How am I being so radically inclusive with the love of Christ that certain people are uncomfortable with that?
Yeah.
And so it's had me questioning some of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard. I do. And I think in our culture, because we can worship so openly and so freely, I think sometimes we are, lulled into not maybe working as hard to live out our faith.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do wonder often, we did this event for a full month where we went and looked at other churches.
Right,
Right? And
yeah.
it was about how do we expand our imagination about what church looks like. And we took a ton of leaders and staff and to go visit these churches. And one of the things I was struck with in that process was I asked the question frequently, would Jesus be comfortable in this church? Or would it make him uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Would Jesus show up at all? Right? And I think for me, the answer is that many of our churches, we're not going to find Jesus there. And I don't mean that like Jesus isn't a part of their church, but I mean like Jesus, if he were here, is going to be where the homeless people are. And he's
Right.
going to be hanging out with the prostitute. And he's going to be having dinner with the sinners. Because why? That's what he did in the Gospels,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's what got Jesus crucified in the first place, was that he was so anti the way the religious establishment believed he should live his life and so outside of the way the empire called him to live his life.
Although he does spend a lot of time in the synagogue, I think it's worth noting though, so he is in those spaces, he
Yep.
is in those worshiping places, but he is often criticizing how things are going. And he's often saying, you've missed the point. You think it's about this, but it's really about this. You think it's about doing rules the right way for the sake of God, maybe earning God's love and loving God well, and for the sake of power.
Yeah.
And you've got it all wrong.
Yeah, I
And
mean, if you look at the Gospels and follow the life of Christ, it is the adventures of missing the point, right? The disciples
yeah.
are constantly missing the point, and the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, are always missing the point.
Well, and one could say the reason Christ came is because humans were missing the point. You know, that there is this way that Christ shows us how to be human, how to live wholeheartedly in the world for the sake of God and furthering God's love.
And I've been wondering too, like, so if that's true, right, that we miss the point in our faith a lot of times.
Yeah.
And that's part of what Paul is saying to the church in Philippi is don't miss the point relationally.
Yeah.
Right? Like don't become so self-concerned that you lose communal unity. Right? That's
Yeah.
part of what he talks about.
Yeah.
And so as we think about our faith life moving from chapter 1 to chapter 2, like where is our faith life making us uncomfortable? Where are we missing the point? Like and I think when we start digging into where we're missing the point, we will be surprised by joy.
Interesting, because we'll uncover patterns or ways that are not life-giving, not God-honoring, not serving our neighbor and each other.
Or we'll uncover where Jesus is.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, I think, where you find joy.
Yeah.
Is where the presence of God is. There you find more joy. And as we dig into our own faith, life, and practice, that's what these adventure questions we ask every day are about. That if we start uncovering that, we'll start uncovering places where we can get more in line back onto the road sign that's driving us towards joy. Or we might uncover the presence of Christ and then experience joy in a new way again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's good.
So as we move into chapter 2, those are kind of the ideas. So am I living and praying and serving in my community with a kind of faith that challenges the prevailing world order? Like, I think that's an important question for us to ask ourselves from the previous chapter. And am I a champion for the faith that Paul preached, that Jesus preached, and that Jesus demonstrated on the cross, and a champion for love at all costs? Like, I think those are really the closing questions to chapter 1 that navigate us into understanding how chapter 2 then comes out of that introduction or that greeting from Paul.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we can jump in to read chapter 2. So we're going to read the entire chapter. If you have your Bible, pull it out now, or your Bible app, whatever it is that you need, or it'll be at the bottom of the screen right below us. You're welcome to read along there as well. So why don't you start, Danielle, and we'll go back and forth.
All right. Chapter 2, Paul writes, if you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other. Love each other. Be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand.
Think of yourselves the way that Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, becoming human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death, and the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion.
Because of that obedience, God lifted him high and honored him far above anyone or anything ever, so that all created beings in heaven and on earth, even those long ago dead and buried, will bow and worship before this Jesus Christ and call out in praise that he is the master of all, to the glorious honor of God the Father.
What I'm getting at, friends, is that you should simply keep on doing what you've done from the beginning. When I was living among you, you lived in responsive obedience. Now that I'm separated from you, keep it up. Better yet, redouble your efforts. Be energetic in your life of salvation, reverent and sensitive before God. That energy is God's energy, an energy deep within you, God himself willing and working at what will give him the most pleasure.
Do everything readily and cheerfully. No bickering, no second guessing allowed. Go out into the world uncorrupted a breath of fresh air, in this squalid and polluted society. Provide people with a glimpse of good living and of the living God. Carry the light-giving message into the night, so I'll have good cause to be proud of you on the day that Christ returns. You'll be living proof that I didn't go to all this work for nothing.
Even if I am executed here and now, I'll rejoice in being an element in the offering of your faith that you make on Christ's altar, a part of your rejoicing. But turnabout's fair play. You must join me in my rejoicing. Whatever you do, don't feel sorry for me. I plan, according to Jesus' plan, to send Timothy to you very soon, so he can bring back all the news of you he can gather. Oh, how that will do my heart good. I have no one quite like Timothy. He is loyal and genuinely concerned for you. Most people around here are looking out for themselves, with little concern for the things of Jesus. But you know yourselves that Timothy's the real thing. He's been a devoted son to me as together we've delivered the message. As soon as I see how things are going to fall out for me here, I plan to send him off. And then I'm hoping and praying that I will be right on his heels.
But for right now, I'm dispatching Epaphroditus, my good friend and companion in my work. You sent him to help me out. Now I'm sending him to help you out. He's been wanting in the worst way to get back with you, especially since recovering from the illness you heard about. He's been wanting to get back and reassure you that he is just fine. He nearly died, as you know, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, he had mercy on me too. His death would have been one huge grief piled on top of all the others.
So you can see why I'm so delighted to send him to you. When you see him again, hale and hearty, how you'll rejoice and how relieved I'll be. Give him a grand welcome, a joyful embrace. People like him deserve the best you can give. Remember the ministry to me that you started but weren't able to complete? Well, in the process of finishing up that work, he put his life on the line and nearly died doing it. It's a lot.
It is a lot.
Chapter 2 is a full cacophony of words for Paul, and it's beautiful. I think one of the things I like most about us doing this together is it's just rare that we read Scripture together, right? As a community, and this long of texts, right? To read what is 30 verses together, back and forth, and to hear the words of Paul spoken by someone else is just really a beautiful thing. So I think
and that's how you sort of get this relational sense that this letter really is carrying. You know, that this is a personal letter to a group of people that Paul really loved. And He cares that they live this out well. He cares that it doesn't depend just on him. I mean, particularly in this chapter, he's sort of like,
Totally.
whether I'm with you or not, this is the call that we have. So he's really trying to press them on with these words into what matters most in the life of faith.
Absolutely, I agree totally. I would say the thesis of this letter is really in that chapter 1, where he talks about how Christians are conduct their lives in a way that's worthy of the gospel. But in chapter 2, you really get at the heart of what he's trying to say directly to this community.
Yeah.
What he's trying to help them to see where they might be missing and really aligning with the heart of Christ as a faith community.
Well, and I say this, I've said this many times in classes that I've done here, that I think we, as the church, maybe in Western culture, I can't speak for other cultures necessarily throughout time, but that in Western culture, we certainly have put Christ up there as this unattainable goal. Like he gives us a glimpse at what it looks like when it's perfect, but we'll never get there. I actually think Paul is saying, no, you can get there, you should get there. And this is the call, that we live out this faith in the same intentional ways Christ did.
Yeah.
Which is pretty convicting, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or scary or encouraging or, for everyone who's always like, I wish the Bible would tell me how to live. I'm sort of like, okay, it has.
Read Paul, because
We
he'll tell
just
you what
don't
to
do
do
it.
all the time. Yeah, that's like
Well,
Paul's
and
way
I don't
is to-
always agree with him.
I
by the
don't
way.
either. One of my friends who's a professor wrote, if Paul was the professor in your school, he would be the one who shows up 45 minutes late to meetings and then complains about all the decisions that were made, which I think is a great.
I always like to say,
Space.
too, that I think Paul is kind of mortified that we're still reading these letters, that he's like, oh my gosh, if I knew that you'd still be reading these thousands of years later, I would have put a few other things in and I would have taken a little bit out. So
Totally, yeah.
we'll see if that's true someday.
So in chapter 2, right, one of Paul's major concerns is this lack of unity in the congregation, not just here in Philippi, but greater, because these letters were passed from community to community and church to church.
If only we could relate to that, to a
Right.
lack of unity.
I know, to a
it
lack
just
of
feels
unity.
very far off right now.
So crazy. And so in the introduction to this passage, he calls on the Philippians to be of the same mind and the same love, doing nothing out of selfish ambition, but looking to the interest of others, right? That Paul's chief example of how to live is Christ Jesus, who being in the very form of God, right? So Jesus becomes this example, the exemplar, which we talk a lot in our classes, that part of who Jesus is for us is he is the exemplar, the way to live our humanity to its fullest.
Yep.
And here he's also drawing in that Jesus is fully God, right? There's this whole connection point in here that we'll get to. So Joseph Hellerman is a theologian who's helped us to look at, in this first section, there's a really essential hymn within the text where the rest of the letter is built off of this hymn. So Hellerman helped us look at this hymn with the context of the Roman Empire. And in his work, he starts with what he calls the Cursus Honorarium, or the course of honor, right? How do you live an honorary life, an honorable life as a citizen, which was the formalized sequence of public offices that a young Roman aristocrat would have followed as he advanced his career, right? Here are the things you would do in order to become the aristocrat you long to be in your 40s or 50s or whatever age it was at that point. At each stage, the upwardly mobile young man gained new responsibility and with that, new privileges, right? So he would take a step up. Lower classes of people, both inside and outside of it, developed their own sequence of offices that mimicked the upper class, right? So there was these ways to gain honor with whatever spectrum of life that you were on. And this was a very normal idea in Roman culture. Hellerman argues that the concern for such honor ratings and status, if anything, were greater than normal in Philippi, because Philippi is like little Rome, right? It's the Roman colony that's trying to be Rome itself. It's trying to live into that space. So this kind of honor living, honor seeking way of life becomes very essential for the people in Philippi.
Yeah.
Because these elites in Philippi were in this Roman city, and it was frequently, as I said, called Little Rome. So the Christian hymn Hellerman argues, was taken as the Cursus Honorarium and then flipped upside down, right? So Paul takes this thing that was very normal in their culture, and says, this is the way society is telling you to live. This is the way of Jesus.
Interesting.
Right? Flips it on its head.
Which Jesus starts, right?
He does it in the entirety of the Gospels,
yes,
right? Even
right.
being born in, I mean, that we could say that God started this, right? Being born in a major,
Good
being
point.
born, all of these things are taking the way that the world sees honor and saying, wait, not in my kingdom.
Yeah.
Right? In my kingdom, things are different.
Right.
The last shall be first, right? This is the way of Jesus. And so Hellerman's arguing that what Paul's doing is the same thing. He's turning this upside down. And so instead of climbing the proverbial corporate or cultural ladder, Jesus descends it. And so Hellerman labels what's happening in Philippi as the cursus padorum, or the course of ignominy, or the course of shame. How do I reverse this? That I'm not trying to be greater, I'm trying to be less. I'm not trying to seek my way, but I'm trying to seek what's good for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really helpful way for us to jump into chapter 1, because it lays the course. If this lays the course for the rest of the letter, it also lays the course for the rest of this chapter and helps us see what Paul is doing culturally, right? This is a culturally significant turn, and part of what, gets Paul in trouble overall within his own journey.
Yeah. Probably part of what gets everyone in trouble. I mean, all the disciples actually ultimately, that there are consequences to following God this intently. And this is how we're supposed to follow God.
Yeah. And this flipping it on its head, right? If this whole thing is about how do we find joy, part of what Paul's saying is, if the world's telling you that the way that you find joy is by getting ahead in the game,
Going up the ladder,
right?
getting
Going
more
up ladder,
status.
having more toys, getting a new boat, getting a new cabin, doing this, right? And we've talked to people all the time. We've experienced it in our own lives that while those things are awesome, right? Getting a new boat's awesome. I mean, I wouldn't know I've never gotten a boat, but I've ridden in a boat before, and it's awesome.
Right.
It's also talk about to people who own boats, they'll tell you the two greatest days of their life were when they bought their boat and when they sold their boat. Right? Because it's a lot of work and everything changes. Another cabin is just a second house you have to take care of.
Right.
And so figuring out that these things that we think are going to get us to a place of joy or happiness, what Paul's saying is Jesus taught us a different way.
Yep.
And it's not going to lead you to joy. If you want joy, you got to walk down the path, not up the path.
And it's never about more by the world standards. It's always about less. That sort of, and it's hard to swallow. To say that is not hard is that's why Paul's going over that in this letter, because the Philippians are sort of like, I am. Can't I have it all? Why can't I have it all?
Yeah.
That's a genuine thing I wrestle with on a constant basis.
Yeah. Have you Marie Kondo'd anything in this pandemic?
Well, so we had just moved. So I had done that for about 4 months. We're pretty good. Have you? You must have. Or you want to?
I love Marie Kondo. So I was an early adapter to Marie Kondo from her book, and then she had the Netflix special. And but what I love about her is this moment where you touch all your stuff and you thank it for what it gave you, and then you give it to someone else.
Right. And you say, does this bring me joy?
Yeah.
If it doesn't, I'm going to let it go. If it does, I'm going to keep it.
Yeah. And then when you let it go, you hold it and you say, thank you, iWatch, for the joy that you brought me. Now you go to find a new home, right? And there's, so for me, part of the journey down instead of up, right, is recognizing these things that we thought might have brought us joy but didn't, honoring them and saying, I release you into the world to be with somebody that it is going to be the thing that they need, right? I think there's a real beauty to that journey that Marie Kondo has taught us in many ways, about how to let go of the things that we thought were going to bring us happiness.
Absolutely. And to stop asking them to do that for us and to start turning to God in some new ways. There was a Lent where my practice was for the 40 days of Lent to get rid of a bag of stuff a day. And what I realized was it was freeing up time in a multitude of ways, because managing your stuff takes a lot of time.
It really does.
A lot of time to put it back, to clean it up, to wash it, to whatever. So there's some truth that less is more, in that you can focus more deeply on what matters most, which some might say this time is even doing for them.
Yeah.
As they're not in the car, they're not having to run around to things. They have to say no to some things because the things have been canceled, and that has freed up more space. Now, at the same time, I think we all notice there's some anxiety that's rising, and I certainly have experienced that and am experiencing that. Just the more I slow down, the more the real stuff comes up, and I have to wrestle with it. Or
Right.
try to stuff it back down with something else.
Right. And the more the tension rises too, right? So it's the anxiety and the stress and the tension, so that then like things that we might have just kept in
Yep.
relationships, now they're bubbling to the surface, and after 7 weeks of being in the same room with the same people, those things are starting to bubble out.
They are.
And we're having to deal with them.
Yep.
Right? And I
Yeah.
think that's part of what Paul says in this first part. If you've gotten anything out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other, love each other, be deep-spirited friends. So that section right there is kind of where I want to stop for today, and just ask you the question, Danielle. He says, if the love of Christ has made any difference in your life. So where have you seen the love of Christ make a difference in your life?
Gosh, I think the love of Christ reoriented my life, truthfully, because I think I have found a home in the church in places that were harder. I guess where other places were harder for me to find a home. And I think that was because of the love of Christ. I think it was the sort of like Paul's saying here, it was the lifestyle that was modeled for me at a young age by people who were compelling, who were interesting, who seemed like, gosh, they have a good life. They seem satisfied with what they're doing. They're not kind of on the treadmill seeking more. They're being present to the person that's right next to them. They're serving where they can. They're, doing all these things. So I would say the love of Christ has reoriented my life because it drew me in and gave me purpose that I couldn't find on my own. Humans are not made to create their own purpose. That is one of the things that I've realized. And I think everything in our culture tells us to create our own meaning and purpose. So that is, to me, that's part of the countercultural way of Christ. And what Christ has taught me is that being connected into something bigger than myself is much more joy-filled and meaningful than just living for myself, because I'm bad at that. I usually choose the wrong things when I'm doing that.
Yeah.
How about for you?
I don't ever remember a time in my life, and this is all gift. I don't ever remember a time in my life where I didn't know the love of God. It's part of how I was raised, right? Being a pastor's kid, being in the church my whole life. Now, there's been times where I haven't loved the love of God, right?
Yeah.
I've resisted it. But so for me, I think part of what the love of Christ has done for me is it's kind of wrapped me in this sense of self-worth and value that I know a lot of other friends of mine have struggled with and really had to discover in new ways that I've known since I was thinking that God loved me, and that's what mattered most.
Yeah.
And I just think about how much of a gift it is to know that you are loved at all moments, and what that's kept me from and what that's led me towards in the fullness of my life has made me paradigmatically who I am today, for sure.
It was interesting when you started that you said, at times I've resisted that love. I've never known a time without it. At times I've resisted it. I think that is interesting too, that kind of opportunity we have to pursue it or let it pursue us
Yeah.
and catch us, or to kind of push it away, which is an
Totally.
interesting part of this as well.
What I think for all of us, right? Like this choice of the course of, ignominy or the course of honor, right? The course of honor is seductive, right? So like
Right.
meaning something in this world, being famous or whatever that means, it draws us. It draws our adolescents in surreal ways, right?
Yes.
Like they're doing and saying things online that we would never have done when we were kids.
Yeah.
But it's because like this course of honor that they're looking for is just all around them all the time.
Yeah.
And of course I've pursued that, right? I've pursued in different parts of my life the course of honor versus the course of ignominy. And finding the delight in the course of ignominy is a gift.
Yeah.
So, well, our questions for the day, our adventure questions are, where are you experiencing conflict currently in your life? Where is conflict in your life holy? And where is it a pattern that is longing to be changed? Right? In other words, kind of the same as suffering, there are conflicts that we're called to navigate and conflicts we're called to avoid. So how do we know the difference between those two, right? And then same question that we asked each other, what difference has Christ's love made in your life?
Yeah.
So what are you starting and stopping?
I think I'm going to stop because this takes intention for me all the time. I mean, I have to constantly set my intention to make a way for the love of Christ instead of blocking it out. And in these days, I'm finding myself drawn back toward doing the easy thing to soothe myself instead of doing the harder thing, which is sticking with seeking love. So I'm going to stop choosing the easy path. And I'm going to start this week, hopefully, trying to cultivate Christ's love and listen to that in a time of our lives right now where the path is not clear. So I think it's harder to listen when the path is not clear.
Totally. Danielle will know this. I love conflict, right? It's like it feeds my soul in some ways. And so
You're not scared of it, for sure.
No, I sometimes create it just for the sake of the fun. So I'm going to try to be more intentional about pausing my desire for conflict, for the energy of conflict, and stop that and start looking for ways that I can love around the conflict, right? Like build a new neural pathway towards love versus conflict.
Yeah. Great.
We'll see how
What
it
a
works.
week.
I know, right?
We got a lot of work to do.
I only did like 2 of my start stops from last time, so this is all good. So we're so glad that you joined us on this journey. May you go in peace, figuring out the places of conflict in your life and learning how to be moved by the love of God. Go in peace.
Amen.